Okay, it is Wednesday, April 15th, and we are recording our class, our Bible class for tonight. We are going to be in Exodus chapter 5. If you want to go ahead and grab your Bible, Exodus chapter 5 is our text for today's class. Those who've been in my classes with this understand this review. I review a lot before we begin each class, so we stay in the timeline, but I also want to review what the class is. We're doing a chronological study of the Bible, and we've been doing it here at Stewart for quite some time, but we just, because of this COVID-19 pandemic, have been recording it and putting it online. And so anybody who is not a member here at Stewart who's watching this is not going to know, the type of study. So this is a chronological study through the Bible where we follow a timeline so that we keep the books, the prophecies, all in their place in time, so that you understand what was happening with Israel at that time, and it makes it easier to understand that particular prophecy, and all of it connects together to lead us to that place where, when you get to the New Testament, Jesus shows up in the fulfillment of all those prophecies. And then we continue that on the New Testament. But we're in Exodus 5 now, and to kind of keep us in our thoughts as far as the timing is concerned, where we are is the Israelites have been in Egypt for a very long time, and it has become a captivity, an oppression even. And Moses has been in the wilderness at this point 40 years. He's an 80-year-old man. His first 40 years he was being raised by Pharaoh's daughter with the assistance, as it were, of Moses' mother himself. But at 40 years old, he had to flee from Egypt, and he spent the next 40 years in the wilderness tending the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro, who was the priest of God of Midian. And in the last couple of classes, what we've gone over in Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 4 is the very familiar account of the burning bush, where Moses sees this bush that is on fire, but it is not being consumed, and so he approaches it to find out what's going on, and it's because God is there, and God is there to challenge him to go back into Egypt to lead the Israelites out of captivity. So there's a discussion that occurs where Moses feels very inadequate, and so he questions, if I go back to Israel, that's where God sent him to the Hebrew people first, and he says, if I go back, who am I going to say sent me? And of course, God explains deity there. He says, tell them that the I am sent me, not never having a beginning, never having an ending, and that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And they're going to know that because they have been looking forward to that day in which God delivered them. So then his other excuses, he can't speak very well, he's not eloquent, he's just not ready. And eventually, after all those excuses in our last class, finally Moses did head back. And in the last part of the text, and this is significant for our starting, is the discussion of the time when Moses and Aaron are before the Hebrew people, and they're performing those three signs. The stick being thrown on the ground, it becomes a snake, and then it becomes a stick again. The hand going into the cloak becomes leprous, and then it is well again. And then the water being poured out on the ground that becomes blood. Now, before I take that further, do you want to add anything before we go into the text?
No, I think it might be important to add that these signs are important in what they are, because if you look back at Egyptian history, they believed that Egyptians had this power from their god Tekka, and one of the powers that the lector priests had was to transform clay into living creatures or to heal diseases, and all these signs are ones that would relate very much to what they were already familiar with.
Yeah, to their gods even.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was actually a part of the instruction from God. Not only certainly was Moses going back to talk to the Israelites, but he had to stand before Pharaoh, and he told Moses that the Israelites would believe him, but that Pharaoh would not, and that God would show signs and ultimately would kill Pharaoh's son. So then he sends them back, and this is actually starting in about verse 27 of chapter 4, is where they're standing before the Israelites, and the signs happen, and the Israelites are prepared now. And so as we start chapter 5, they're going to go in to see Pharaoh. And the reason I wanted to highlight the discussion in the end of chapter 4 with these, where Moses and Aaron stand before the Hebrew peoples, because the very first thing you see in chapter 5 is afterward. And that's one of those words I try to highlight, words that maybe we just read over, but that have some kind of a meaning if we just stop and consider them. And afterward is connecting to this discussion that Moses and Aaron have with the Hebrew people. So he says, Moses went to them, and that helps us keep our timing. Moses went to them, they believed, and now the elders of Israel as well as Moses and Aaron will go to Pharaoh. So, chapter 5 of Exodus, beginning in verse 1. Afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. Now, that's obviously a well-known account when Moses stands before Pharaoh. And I find it interesting, I try to place myself in each one of these texts to understand what's happening from a human perspective. What would he be thinking? What would he be planning, or things of that nature? And I have to know that if it's me, if I'm in Moses' shoes here and I'm going before Pharaoh, obviously I am struggling a little bit with this idea that I'm hopeful that I'm not going to get in trouble because 40 years earlier I ran away from Egypt. I'm hopeful that Pharaoh will agree to this desire from God to let the people go. But on the other hand, I already know that God has stated that he's not going to listen, that he's stubborn, that his heart is going to be hard, and that he's not going to let them go. And so there would be a little bit of an emotional struggle as he comes into this meeting. And I suppose that from a human perspective would be challenging, because I understand the responsibility to trust in God, to have faith, to know that God's promises are always fulfilled. But having that knowledge in your head is not the same thing as being able to actually live it in your life. And when you're dealing with actual circumstances is when it's difficult for your life. So you can imagine the real challenge of Moses and Aaron just stepping up and saying to Pharaoh, look, God said, let my people go, and Pharaoh says, I don't know your God, and I'm not bowing to his power. He's got enough of his own gods.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that this is a turning point for the character of Moses, because everything previous to this, Moses has been a little whiny, a little bit of a baby, and here we go and see him confronting Pharaoh. To the Egyptian people was considered a god, a deity. And Moses is confronting him directly.
He is gaining confidence, isn't he?
Yeah, he's definitely gaining confidence. I also think it's important to note that God doesn't start off by instructing Moses to say, hey, free my people from bondage. He's starting much smaller. He's saying, let them go into the wilderness for this one festival.
Right, that's our, in fact, let's go ahead and read that. Let's start in verse 3. So they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Then the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your labor. And I've heard people discuss, if God already knew this, and really what he's challenging Pharaoh to do is let the people go so they can go to this land that flows in milk and honey, then why even make this proposal of the 3 days in the wilderness? That wasn't the plan at all. But what I see in this, and for those who have been in my class, we're in my class before we started having to do this online, that was brought up earlier in the text. Why approach it from a 3-day perspective? And the answer is, if Moses were to go before Pharaoh and just say, hey, look, we want to all be set free, and Pharaoh says no, then the Israelites are going to really struggle with that, and they'll wonder, why didn't you start lower? It's kind of an idea of negotiation. And so God starts with this idea of, look, he wasn't even going to let you go worship. It's not a matter of not letting you free. He wasn't going to let you go at all. So this is God proving to the people that he already knows the result of this.
I also think it's interesting how God is shifting the blame here. How he's not saying, I'm going to strike you with plagues. He's saying, if you can't allow my people to go, there will be plagues to suffer. It's almost as if he's putting the control to prevent all of this into the hands of Pharaoh.
Right. Here's the consequences. Now you choose. Yeah. And Pharaoh chose. He was stubborn enough to choose. But of course, he didn't believe that God had the power to do anything anyway. He believed that his gods could control the situation. And so he says to Moses and Aaron, it's not going to happen. But he also, this is a circumstance where this is hurting the productivity of Egypt. If they journey out in the wilderness, the slaves are not going to be working for these 3 days or whatever that were requested. And so Pharaoh says, look, you're just distracting the people. You're keeping them from doing their job. And so, I'm not letting them go, and you need to let the people get back to work.
Yeah. And Pharaoh then goes on to do exactly what he was complaining about, but making it harder for the people to do their work.
All right, starting in verse 5. And Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest from their labor. So the same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, you shall no longer give the people straw to make brick as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And you shall lay on them the quota of bricks which they made before. You shall not diminish it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry out, saying, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let more work be laid on the men, that they may labor in it, and let them not regard false words. Now, I want to start with the end there, and that is the idea that he is proclaiming that these are false words. In other words, he doesn't believe in their God, and so for Moses to show up, he sees Moses as his challenge, not God. And so he says these are just false words. Moses is lying about where this is coming from, and he wants to lead the people, and I'm not letting them go. And in fact, I'm going to make it harder. I'm going to make it harder. I want to make it their job more difficult, so they have to work longer. Because quite frankly, if they've got time off and they're getting together and they're discussing this, then that's going to create more problems for me. And so I'm going to keep them busy, and that will make it impossible for them to make plans to do anything else.
Starting with the beginning, you realize that although Pharaoh doesn't fear the Israelite God, he does fear the Israelites, because the first thing he says is, look, there are so many of them.
They've grown.
They have multiplied and grown. No matter how hard of circumstances he throws at them, they've continued to grow. And I think this might be an indication that he's trying to prevent them from growing any more powerful, because he knows what they might be capable of.
And that connects back because it was 80 years earlier when the Pharaoh of the time recognized the power of the Israelites and their growth and their prosperity, and he put into place that edict where all males were to be killed of the Hebrew people. And you remember it went wrong, the midwives wouldn't do it, and you remember ultimately Moses was placed in that basket in the river by his mother. So you know that 80 years earlier, he'd already recognized, or Pharaoh had already recognized, that there was a problem with their prosperity and their power, and so he tried to put them more under control, and that didn't work. 80 years later, they're still powerful, maybe more powerful. He is still afraid of the people and their rebellion, and so he just makes everything as hard as he can to make sure that they can no longer have any time off, have any time to plan or organize or whatever. So he says, look, you got to make the same number of bricks that you've been making before, but now I'm not giving you the material to make the bricks. You've got to gather that up yourself. Anything else before I go on?
No.
All right, verse 10. And the taskmasters of the people and their officers went out and spoke to the people, saying, thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go, get yourself straw where you can find it, yet none of your work will be diminished. So the people scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble instead of straw. Now we'll stop there just a second. Again, the plan. The plan is now taken to the people by the slaves, by those who are supposed to carry it out, and it is, you've got to keep working, you've got to keep making bricks, but we're not going to give you any supplies anymore. And evidently there had been a kind of a network of supply. Because what happens is the Israelites or the Hebrews, they go out now to try to gather their grain, but everything close to them, it's gone. All they can get that's close is stubble, which is not going to be as effective in making the quota that they have to make. And so they've got to go further and further and further to try to find any kind of supply. So this is a significant impact on a nation that is trying to, just trying to survive.
Yeah. I think this is also a little bit of foreshadowing, because one of the main things they would use to reinforce the bricks they would make were reeds that would grow in the river. And just a few chapters later, God is going to take them through the Reed Sea, or in our translations, the Red Sea, which was apparently scattered with so many reeds and wildlife and plants and fibrous materials that they could have made bricks out of.
Yeah, just a little ways away, huh? All right, verse 13. And the taskmasters forced them to hurry, saying, fulfill your work, your daily quota, as when there was straw. Also the officers of the children of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and were asked, why have you not fulfilled your task in making brick both yesterday and today as before? I think it's interesting here. You see this later on when the nation of Israel is in the land of Canaan, and they have divided up into two nations, and the northern kingdom has been taken away in captivity by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians come into power, and Nebuchadnezzar leads them in 605 BC to take the southern kingdom. And what ends up happening is the very first part of the book of Daniel describes to us what took place, and that is this Nebuchadnezzar took Daniel, and of course we have three others named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whom we know better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are four of the individuals that are taken, but all of those who were taken were young, and they were good-looking people, and they were impressionable, and they were intelligent. And the reason they were taken in this first carrying away is because they could be integrated into the Chaldean society, so they then became the leaders over the newly obtained slaves. And that seems to be the case as to what's happened here in Egypt as well. The Israelites have people who are over them, who are their taskmasters and their officers, but the officers are from Israel. And you know that because they also are being beaten here. They also were slaves. But they're responsible for the people. So it's almost like Pharaoh and Egypt is in control of the slaves, but they're trying to do it in in today's words, in an isolating kind of way. And you remember way back when Jacob and the family ends up in Egypt in the first place, when the famine has gone on for some time, that the reason they're in Goshen and the reason they're left alone is because the Egyptians won't be around shepherds. And you know that what ended up happening was they became very isolated. So even as the taskmasters make the making of bricks harder and the quota harder to obtain, they're still not interacting directly with these slaves except for the officers that are put over them. And so they're beating the officers so that the officers then will be hard on the people. But the idea is maybe their own people will be able to motivate them to get the job done.
I just think it's interesting that this is apparently a very common form of controlling a nation in the old world, because you see it here with Egypt, you see it later with Babylon, and then you see it in the New Testament with the Roman Empire doing the same thing of letting them self-regulate with the guidance of a few officials.
Yeah. And it makes it all harder for them. All right, verse 15. And then the officers of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, why are you dealing thus with your servants? There's no straw given to your servants, and they say to us, make brick. And indeed your servants are beaten, but the fault is in your own people. But he says, you're idle, you're idle. Therefore you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Therefore go now and work, for no straw shall be given to you, yet you shall deliver the quota of bricks. And the officers of the children of Israel saw that they were in trouble after it was said, you shall not diminish any bricks from your daily quota. So, they're not measuring up. They're not able to, they just don't have enough time, enough ability, enough manpower to now go from making bricks based off of the material given to them to gaining all their own material and then also making the bricks. There's just not enough time and talent or ability to do it. So they go before Pharaoh and they make a plea. Help us out here. But the problem is he's mad now. And God had already told Moses that he was that stubborn, that it was going to be a problem, that he wasn't going to listen. But the Israelites weren't at the burning bush. They didn't hear that from God. All they've heard is what Moses has told them from God. And so they go to Pharaoh and they say, it's too hard. We cannot keep up. We cannot meet our quota. We cannot gather up all the supplies to make the bricks. It's just not going to work. And Pharaoh says, well, then how did you have time to show up and try to make a plan to go out in the wilderness and worship? If you got time to goof off, basically he says, if you got time to goof off, you got time to work. It's just not going well.
And I think at this point you might start to realize that maybe Moses and Aaron whitewashed the story of the burning bush just a little bit. They didn't tell the Israelites about all of these terrible things that God warned them of, that Pharaoh's heart is going to be hard, that there's going to be plagues. They just, looks like they might have told them the good stuff and left out some of the worser side.
Or at least the people focused on the good stuff.
They heard what they wanted to hear.
Yeah. Verse 20. Then as they came out from Pharaoh, they met Moses and Aaron, who stood there to meet them. And they said to them, "Let the Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us." Now, if you can imagine, all these years that these people have cried out under the labor and the harshness of Pharaoh. In fact, that's what God told Moses at the burning bush, that he has heard their cry and their suffering and their despair. So they've gone through all of that. You can imagine as Moses shows up and performs these miraculous signs, how excited they would be, how thrilled they would be about the possibility we're finally going to be set free. We're finally going to go to the land that's been promised to us all the way back to Abraham. And now it goes as far opposite of that as it could possibly go. From the heights of excitement down to the depths of, we may not even survive this. I mean, they basically accuse Moses and Aaron, not God, Moses and Aaron, God's spokesman. They basically accuse them of saying, "You've actually signed our death sentence. You've given them a reason to kill us."
Yeah, well, Moses and Aaron, it appears as if, have at least angered Pharaoh to the point where he's made the Israelite work impossible to complete, which then would give him the opportunity to seek punishment for that.
Now, it's easy if you think about it from the Hebrew people's perspective. They didn't see God. They haven't felt like God's been around for very long anyway. And so, the fact that they didn't see God, and, you could see them easily becoming weak during this time and not understanding and becoming discouraged. But Moses did see God. Moses saw him. He spoke to him. He saw the evidence of everything that was going to happen, and he's seen it since, even on his journey back and everything that happened with him. So Moses may be different, except for, let's start reading in verse 22. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, neither have you delivered your people at all." So it is the case that Moses also heard what he wanted to hear. He heard that the people were going to be set free. He heard that God was going to let them, use him to lead them. What he didn't hear is when God said Pharaoh's going to be stubborn and he's not going to let you go, and I'm going to have to do these signs until Pharaoh's son dies. He didn't hear that. And so when the people complained to Moses that everything got harder, Moses went to God and said, "Why didn't you do what you said you were going to do?" Well, nothing has changed. It's the case a lot of times today, far too often today, that people who are, maybe they become a Christian, they obey the gospel, or maybe somebody's been a Christian for some time. When something bad goes on in their lives, they blame God, they question God. How many times have people said, how could a loving God allow this kind of suffering to happen? How many times have people asked that question? People are asking that question today. And the answer is, we are looking at things from a perspective that is so limited, yet God's perspective is so big. Moses' perspective was, these are my people, they're struggling. God said, go get them, I'm going to get them. God's perspective was, they're not ready to go. So things are going to have to happen before they're ready to go. And he told him about it before they ever got there, and he still didn't get it. So the reason I highlight that is because it's very easy to make Moses kind of a superhero character, because we know what he does in leading the people in the wilderness, and we know all of that. But the bottom line is, he's human just like the rest of us, and he struggles just like the rest of us.
Yeah. And although the way Moses goes about this line of questioning is obviously wrong, I do find that there's something relatable and almost encouraging about it, because Moses, who we've read about a few chapters earlier, has now become so bold that he can confront God when there are things that he doesn't understand. And sometimes I wish that we had that courage to confront God, not obviously in an accusatory way, but to ask God to explain things to us.
And then spend the time finding the answer in the scriptures.
Yeah. And yet, Moses got halfway there.
Yeah, and God will assure him. In fact, that's where we'll go in our next class next Wednesday night. God will challenge his faith to stand up, challenge Moses to stand up and trust him, to listen to what he has said, and to follow through on all what God sent him to do. It's going to work. God's plans always work out the way God wants them to work out. They just don't always fit what we think they should fit or when we think they should fit. You know, Moses wants them out, and he wants them out this way, and he wants them out right now. And none of those things are going to happen the way that that Moses wants them to go. All right, anything else?
No, I think that's all I had.
Okay, well, I think we're a little more brief. I don't even have a clock, so I don't know. I think we're a little more brief tonight, but next Wednesday, I don't know why I cough every time we record. Next Wednesday night, we will be in Exodus chapters, I think 6 and 7. Yeah, Exodus chapters 6 and 7. So hopefully, we'll probably go longer next week. Hopefully you'll join us then. Let's close with a prayer. Father, we're so thankful for the opportunity to be in this study of your word, and we're so thankful for the accounts that you have preserved for us that help us to recognize how faith grows, to help us to recognize the importance of trusting you, to know that even when circumstances in our life look one way, that you know the true way that they are to go, and help us to have the courage to trust you and walk with you in those times as well. Help us always, Father, not to depend upon ourselves. Forgive us where we fail you. In Christ's name, amen.